Confessional Poetry. As the name implies, confessional poetry is a poetry of self-revelation. The Academy of American Poets defines confessional poetry as the poetry of the personal, or I. Confessional poets often write in the first person using straightforward and sometimes explicit language. This literary movement is marked by its intimate, autobiographical subject matter that serves to reveal the author's repressed anguish or deepest emotions through his or her poems. This genre dealt with subject matters that were considered taboo and previously not openly discussed in society. Common themes include sex and sexuality, troubled marriages and infidelity, mental illness, death and suicidal thoughts, fear of failure, and depression.
Confessional poetry emerged in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. It is generally accepted that the publication of Robert Lowell's book of poems, Life Studies, marks the beginning of the confessional school of poetry. Although confessional poetry continues to be a major influence on contemporary poets, its popularity declined in the 1970s when a new movement called New Formalism emerged. New Formalism promoted a return to metrical and rhythm verse of traditional poetic forms. The chief characteristics of confessional poetry are first-person narration. All confessional poems are written from a first-person point of view, allowing the reader to look closely into the thoughts and feelings of the author. Intimate subject matter. Confessional poetry focuses on subject matter once considered taboo. Issues were typically considered embarrassing and shameful. Autobiographical. Confessional poets purposely reveals intimate aspects of their private lives in their poems. The poet and the speaker are considered one and interchangeable. Lyrical craftsmanship. Confessional poets paid careful attention to the use of rhythm and intonation in their poems.
Although confessional poetry is not a political movement, it is partly influenced by the social unease in the 1950s and the upheavals of the 1960s. At that time, there was an artistic and cultural shift away from the traditional forms of poetry and literature. A group of poets called Beat Generation rebelled against established traditions of poetry. The poets of this group, like Allen Ginsberg, started a trend towards self-revelation. Confessional poetry rebelled against the following: New Criticism, Modernist movement, the social and literary taboos of the 1950s. New Criticism is a literary movement in the mid-1900s that emphasizes close examination of text without regard to the biographical or historical circumstances in which it is produced. Confessional poets rejected this method in favor of an intimate and autobiographical approach. Modernist movement. Confessional poetry was a reaction to the impersonal academic poetry of writers like T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, and Ezra Pound. Confessional poets did not believe in the distinction between the poet and the speaker of the poem. Confessional poets rejected the social and literary taboos of the 1950s by exploring private experiences that had not been openly discussed in poetry.
The following were four poets who were known to be the pioneers in the confessional tradition. W. D. Snodgrass, 1926-2009. W. D. Snodgrass, an American poet, is credited with being one of the founding members of the confessional school of poetry. Published in 1959, his Pulitzer Prize-winning collection of poems, Heart's Needle, had a tremendous impact on many confessional poets. This book chronicles his divorce and his loss of custody of his daughter, Cynthia Jean. Robert Lowell, 1917 to 1977. Robert Lowell was born into a wealthy Boston family, and his descendants included a Civil War hero and a signer of the U.S. Constitution. Robert Lowell is best known for his book of poems, Life Studies, which was published in 1959. In this book, Lowell talks about his upbringing, family interrelationships, and his own mental illness. Sylvia Plath, 1932 to 1963. Sylvia Plath was an American poet, novelist, and a short story writer. She was seen as one of the most exceptional poets of her time. Her poems about her life experiences made her so popular that she has risen to a cult status among her readers. Plath is best known for her collection Ariel, published in 1965, 2 years after her death. Anne Sexton, 1928 to 1974. Anne Sexton was born Anne Gray Harvey in Newton, Massachusetts. Sexton, who suffered from bipolar disorder, took up poetry at the suggestion of her therapist. In her poetry, Sexton explored the themes of depression and isolation, as well as abortion and female sexuality. She won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1967 for her book Live or Die.
A major art form that emerged during this period is confessional art. This is a form of contemporary art that focuses on an intentional revelation of the private self. Louise Bourgeois is a French-American artist and sculptor. She was generally recognized as the mother of confessional art. One of her best-known works is Mama, a giant sculpture of a spider. Another well-known confessional artist is Frida Kahlo, a Mexican painter who is best known for her self-portraits. One of her best-known paintings is Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair. One thing that we found interesting about this period is how the writer's works were so overwhelmingly intertwined with their lives. Sadly, 2 of the leading confessional poets have decided to end their own lives. Sylvia Plath committed suicide at the age of 30, and Anne Sexton at the age of 46. Another interesting fact is the huge spillover effect of confessional poetry's influence on contemporary literature. It has now become popular to write memoirs about one's mental issues and traumatic experiences. We hope you learned more about confessional poetry, and thanks for watching.